Hello, and welcome to another new episode of Emotional Eating Unwrapped. I'm your host, Alana Kessler. I am so happy to be here today in the beginning of summer. It's like my favorite time of the year. Not only is it light for a really long time, um, June 21st, June 20th, June 21st are like my two favorite days of the year because it's just daylight for such a long time. And since I moved to Louisville, Kentucky, it's closer to the limit of the time zone, the Eastern time zone. And so actually sunset isn't until 10 p.m. And so I'm just living my best life here with so much daylight. And yeah, I'm happy to be here today because today's episode is inspired by something that I myself have personally experienced and have done a couple times in my in my time being coached by different coaches receiving different support, and also things that I've observed through my own experience with my own clients and when I'm coaching them. And what we're going to talk about today is this mindset block that happens when we we decide to invest and receive support for ourselves from a coach. And why I wanted to talk about this today is because I think that this happens to so many more people than we think. And I think that when we decide to invest in coaching and to trust someone, it's no small thing. And I think it's really important to just shine a light on the fact that whenever we put ourselves in positions of vulnerability, of trusting someone else with our healing, with our personal experiences, we have this desire to get from one place where we don't feel great and we're feeling bad, and we have this desire to get to this other place where we want to feel good, and we have an idea of what that looks like. And then we decide to invest in support in that arena. I think it's really important to acknowledge that that is a very vulnerable, and for our nervous system and for our brains can feel really risky. And it really is no small thing to trust someone with your healing. And I think it's important to acknowledge that something that happens for so many people, and like I said, it happens for me, we go into this protective mode. We go into this mode where all of a sudden we become skeptical of the person that we just hired. We become skeptical of everything that we thought was going to be, you know, better than sliced bread before we invested, right? So cuz before we invested, we had this idea that this was going to be amazing, this was going to be great. I'm going to get to the other side. It's all great. And then all of a sudden we make that investment, we trust this person, and now we're becoming skeptical and actually looking to poke holes and find ways to undermine that support. And I'll tell you that I've done this before. And it is almost like, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's almost an unconscious, and it's a normal thing. It is just our nature to be protective when we put ourselves in a space of vulnerability, when we put ourselves in a space of letting go of control, of trusting someone else. And I think for the women, at least, that listen to this podcast and that are in my coaching and course communities, many of them are in control and do it really well in so many areas of their lives. And so it is no small thing to not only acknowledge that help is needed, but to actually put yourself in a position to not be the expert and to not have the answers, and say, okay, I'm willing to trust that someone can hold the space with me and for me, and shepherd me through to the other side. And that is not a small thing. And oftentimes, subconsciously, what happens is these defense mechanisms come up, and it oftentimes rears its head as skepticism, skepticism and uh, trying to, creating a little bit of conflict, criticism. So I just want to name these things because it's also really easy to get convinced when we're in this space of defense, of feeling defensive, and it's not conscious, right? Like we haven't said to ourselves, okay, this is just a natural thing that's going to come up. It's like we're still in the eye of the storm. We haven't zoomed out and created the witness mind around this vulnerable experience yet. And so that skill of being able to say, oh, okay, this is defensiveness because I just made a very vulnerable move in my life. And this skepticism and, feeling of critique and criticism isn't my isn't my intuition talking. This is my defensiveness talking. And I think understanding the difference between what is your intuition, your inner voice, and what is your defended voice. And that can be a really difficult thing to discern. And so today I just want to take you through a couple of steps that can help you get to the place where you know the difference between is your intuition telling you something correct when it comes to your coaching, or is this a defensive mechanism that could potentially undermine your goal for healing, right? Because are we letting our fear of being vulnerable getting in the way of what we really want, which is to heal, to feel and look our best? So let's go into the ways that you can feel more empowered in your decision and be able to hold space for the discomfort of being vulnerable, and even recognize the defensive feeling and be able to live in that feeling of defensiveness. But you're also able to shift your mindset so that you can recognize and almost be the coach to your almost be the coach to yourself, where you could say to yourself, okay, I'm feeling this way, but I think this might be my defensiveness speaking. Let me take this feeling through a process and see if I can find a more clear-cut answer, whether I'm just being skeptical and critical because I'm feeling defensive or scared or vulnerable, or whether or not this is true and maybe I hired the wrong coach and this isn't going to work for me. So the first thing that it's important that you do is that you do the due diligence you need to do for yourself in advance so that you can feel really empowered in your decision, right? So this means that you're not just going to get caught up in somebody's marketing. You're not going to get caught up in somebody's Disney movie that they're putting in front of you. You're not going to get caught up in the hype, because it's really, marketing is a real thing in this industry. Marketing is a real thing. And it's really easy to get activated, for people to activate your emotions and get you to buy into what they're selling and keep you in that state of not being discerning. And that's where what happens is, if you don't practice discernment in your decision-making process for when you're going to hire somebody as your guide, as your coach, as your support system, and you bypass that discernment process, that's when you trigger your nervous system to become skeptical and defensive once you commit. Okay, so if you do the discerning and what I like to call the pre-qualification. So, you ask questions. Do what you need to do to know in your heart that you believe this coach's method will provide you the success you're looking for, that it will truly meet your needs and get you to your goal. So, what you need to do is you need to be really clear and connected to what your needs are from support. Like, what do you really need? What are you looking for? And what are your actual goals? And you need to make sure that the support you're investing in can get you to the goal practically, right? Not just in flowery language. Okay. It's like any relationship, right? I talk to the women that I work with a lot about this because, as you know, for me, healing emotional eating, weight loss, everything is very holistic in this holistic ecosystem that's connected to feeling connected to yourself, feeling connected to others, being able to create the life you deserve. And that includes love and connection. And I have the same conversations with the women I work with about dating, right? It's like we can have this idea of what someone is going to be like or what it's going to feel like to be in a relationship, to feel in love, to feel supported, and, being in a partnership. And we can get so caught up in that idea of the end result that we forget to qualify the person that's in front of us and make sure that they actually have the meat, they actually have they actually have what you need to make you feel that way once you commit and once you're in something. And it's the same thing with coaching. It's the same thing with getting support. It's really easy for somebody to lay out your desires and how you want to feel and the results. But if you don't ask the right questions based on your own needs, your own goals, your own desires, make sure that they have the skills, they have what you need to get you there. It's, that's what you need to do. And that's something that is your responsibility to do before. And therefore, when you do that, that's not necessarily going to completely eliminate that vulnerable feeling once you do commit, but it's going to make you feel a lot more empowered and a lot more, feel a lot more like you have a tangible reason and you're not just blindly in blind faith, just trusting somebody because you have those answers in advance. And then the second thing is, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but you want to recognize that this is a defense mechanism that's rooted in fear and letting go of control. Okay, so all of the critiques, the criticism, um, any negativity that comes up, any kind of, again, like I said, skepticism or kind of trying to poke holes in whatever the coach's framework is or something like that, really just pushing back a lot. If you notice that you do that, you're pushing back or you're kind of resisting, recognize that this is a defense mechanism that's rooted in fear and letting go of control. Because like I said earlier, when we get to the place in our journey where we are like, I need help, I need support, and we start to imagine what that's going to be, it's really easy to get into this rumination place and this place of optimism, right? Because it takes a lot of courage to, one, admit that you need help, and two, to actually take the action steps and make the effort to get help. And it feels really empowering to admit that you need help and then to start taking the steps to get help. And it puts us in a really optimistic state, right? We start looking for evidence that it's going to work for us because we did the hard work of acknowledging that we need support, right? We've come out of the place where we, where we don't want support, we've done the self-worth work where we're like, okay, I deserve to live a better life. I deserve to achieve my goals. I deserve to look and feel how I want. And I also have the self-worth to recognize that I don't need to do it alone and that I can seek out support. And once you get to that place, there's a certain relief that leads to optimism. And then what happens is that we start looking for things to verify that optimism, and we start wanting to believe that people could help us and that people have that answer. And that's when we're most susceptible to being, that's when we're most susceptible to buying into something, unless we do the step we did before, which is the discernment part. Okay. And so what happens is if you don't do the discernment part and you end up going into something without that part, you can go from optimism to pessimism really quickly. And the truth is that happens anyway a little bit, right? If you think about if you've ever gotten help before, right? Like you invest and there's this sense of possibility, optimism, everything like that, and it's all, roses and rainbows. And then you start and it's really happening now. And all of a sudden it's like you notice that your brain and your nervous system is starting to try and give you evidence that it's not the right thing. Okay? Like that will happen. That will happen for most people anyway. But that is something that is really important that you really, really recognize and remember, is just the natural defense protective mechanism that happens when you invest. And that you don't want to stay in this skeptical place, right? It's your job, and this is what I really want this episode to be about, is that when we can really believe that our feelings are the reality. But most of the time, and I would say like 90 to 95% of the time, what we feel is not the reality. What we feel is just an invitation to explore deeper what the reality is, so that we can, that we could be there for ourselves in a way that supports ourselves to the highest degree, and we don't sabotage ourselves. So when you feel that sense of pessimism after you've invested in something, when you were so optimistic before, it's not that you made a mistake. It's not that it's all of a sudden not the right thing. It's just the natural way that the body and the mind and the nervous system respond to letting go of control and to being vulnerable. And so the last thing that I want to share about what to do is to have compassion for yourself, right? Really practice self-compassion from this witness place, right? So you have to recognize that my feelings aren't real. Let me pause. Let me ask myself, did I ask the questions? Did I do my due diligence? Did I know what my needs were and what kind of support I was looking for before? And if I did that and I felt good about my commitment and my investment, then this is just uncomfortable feelings that I have to deal with right now. But like, there's no reason to feel like this was a mistake. There's no reason to feel like this is skeptical, and hold space for that within you with compassion. And something that I actually always invite my clients to do when this happens for them, which I oftentimes, when I start working with people, always share that it will, I invite them to share that with me, right? Share with me your skepticism. Share with me the critique, because one of the biggest ways to pacify that really hot feeling of pessimism, or like when we start to be skeptical and be really in our heads about stuff, one of the biggest ways to pacify that or have that go away is to air it out. Because, like anything that is kind of like a negative, dark thing in our, in our emotional body, the second you take it out of the shadows, the less power it actually has. So I always invite my clients to, and my students, I always invite them to just, the second that you start feeling like you're all of a sudden having that skepticism, your brain is getting in the way of the trusting, of the receiving support, and starting to create these skeptical narratives, these criticisms, these critiques, these thoughts like, oh my God, I think this isn't going to work for me, or like, this is the wrong thing. Say it out loud, and really take that initiative to get the direct answer that it is the right thing, right? Maybe you didn't ask the questions in advance, but you can definitely ask the questions once you've invested, right? So you don't have to sit with these skeptical, heavy negative feelings. And that's also a way that you have compassion for yourself. You could have compassion for yourself for feeling this way and knowing that it's probably a defense mechanism, but you don't just have to convince yourself of it. You can get the verified evidence by asking questions and by airing out that this is how you feel, and by asking for the coach and the teacher, the guide, to remind you why it is the right decision. Okay, so these are all things that are under your control. Okay, so there's no need. So skepticism is really just a messenger that's telling you that it needs you to give it more reassurance, right? And if you see it that way, you're not going to sabotage yourself in the long run for your goals. Okay? So let me know what you think about this. Have you had this experience before where you've invested in something and, you've had this really optimistic feeling in advance, and, or even when you did commit, you had this kind of Disney movie type of idea about it, and then you started and all of a sudden it like flipped a switch, and it just all of a sudden felt really heavy and negative. If you have, I'd love to hear about it. If you have any questions about this, like I said in other episodes, we have a Q&A tab. Cassie, my co-pilot Cassie, and I love doing the Q&A episode. So please feel free to ask us any questions that you might have. And we would love to answer them for you. So thank you again so much for joining me today. And don't forget to join me again next week. Please subscribe, leave a review. I love sharing these topics with you about emotional eating so that you can fall in love with eating and start losing weight, keeping it off with sustainable strategies, self-love, and lasting change. And please, if you found this episode helpful, share it, leave a review, subscribe. I also have tons of free resources on my website to support you on your journey to loving food and losing weight. Just go to www.bewellbyak.com. And until next time, I'm Alana, and thank you for listening to Emotional Eating Unwrapped.